There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shaun of Shaun Breathes Books. Welcome back. It has been so hot in Saskatoon this week that I haven't really been outside at all. And today is a little cooler, but I'm still so tired from how hot it was yesterday that I didn't even consider trying to lug stuff out. Plus, I do have a heavy book to tell you about, or to introduce you to, or whatever, a little later in the broadcast. And I've had kind of a weird week, and I might as well start with the reason that it's been weird. And that is the news that broke, I believe it was on Sunday, but anyway, a few days ago, about Alice Munro and how evil she was. And that was devastating to me, and I want to stop right there and say that she's dead to me. Well, she did die, but this is a much more serious death. I will never read her again, and I will probably divest my library of her books. I'm going to wait a while before taking that step, but that's probably coming down the pipe. However, I have a new hero, and that is her daughter, Andrea Robin Skinner. So, Alice is off her pedestal and dead to me, and that is heartbreaking for me. But that is not nearly as heartbreaking as what Andrea Robin Skinner, her daughter, endured by her negligence and cruelty. I know you know about it, and if you don't, you can just Google Alice Munro daughter. It's all over the news. So I want to center her courage and her story rather than my devastation as a reader, as somebody who Alice Munro's stories meant, past tense, meant so much to me. And I love the fact that Andrea had the support of her siblings and step-siblings and so on. There was a joint, that kind of support hopefully made up for the horrific neglect and endangerment of her biological parents, not just Alice Munro, but her ex-husband. I think his name was Jim Munro, who turned a blind eye to the abuse that the stepfather perpetrated on her. Oh my God, what a horrible experience. I could dwell on how devastated I was, because I am devastated by the news, but more importantly, what a brave woman Andrea Robin Skinner is, and may she find some peace. I am the kind of reader that cannot separate the artist from the art. Absolutely not. And I'm not judging anybody else who's able to, but I am not built that way, and thus Alice Munro is dead to me as a writer, and certainly as a kind of Canadian hero. So that happened, and that was kind of cast a pall over the week. And that's been about it, actually. One more thing that I'm really excited about is my appearance on the Hamilton Review of Books podcast went live a couple days ago, and it's about pride literature, so it was a few days late, but goodness, you should be reading queer stuff all year round, and I'm really pleased with how the chat with Alex, who's been a frequent guest on my bite-sized book chats and recently my Zooming In series, how that went on his podcast. So check it out. There'll be a link in the show notes, and you should all subscribe to the Hamilton Review of Books podcast. I really enjoyed listening back to, we came off sounding rather like we knew what we were talking about. So that was great. All right, without further ado, wow, what a fabulous conversation I get to share with you now. This week's mystery guest. And this week's mystery guest is the reader, professor, and critic, Rowan Maitland, joining us from Halifax. Hello, Rowan. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Shall I call you Professor? I'd probably not. I'll call you Rowan. Is that okay?
Rowan is perfect.
Rowan is very active on Bookish Twitter and friends with all my friends on Bookish Twitter, and was maybe, about 6 or 8 months ago, a guest on the Moots and the Gripes podcast, talking about Victorian literature, and we've been hovering around each other, and here we are today, meeting for the first time, and I've already had a great chat. So, let's see, reader, professor, critic. Let's start maybe with the professor part of your bookish identity. Tell us about your academic scholarship.
Yeah, well, honestly, I can't really separate my life as a professor from my life as a reader. I always feel like I have been incredibly fortunate at finding a profession that is a place to express what it's like to really care about reading and really take it seriously. So I am a professor in the Department of English at Dalhousie University in Halifax, where it is currently very muggy and damp and summery. And I teach mostly courses in Victorian literature, which is my main passion, my main enthusiasm. I sometimes only half jokingly say that my whole career is the fault of my happening across Middlemarch when I was quite young, taking a backpacking trip across Europe when there were not a lot of English language books to hand. And I read Middlemarch on the train and never turned back. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but not a lot. And I also teach courses in detective fiction, which seems to happen a lot to people who teach Victorian literature because the genre emerges out of the 19th century. And that has become a kind of go-to teaching specialty for me as well. It's always a popular class, and it's always a lot of fun, and it gets me kind of out of my comfort zone a lot because I teach more contemporary stuff there. So that lets me stretch.
I was hoping I could find, I keep finding and then losing an epigraph to one of the chapters in Middlemarch. It's just one of the most beautiful things that I've ever read. And every time somebody says they're reading Middlemarch, I say, when you get to that quote, and I describe that the epigraph, send it to me. And I've lost it again. But anyway, it's the one about, see if I'm being curious to see if you remember it. It's the one about standing under a huge old bell, and I can't remember what the person does that resounds, that makes the bell resound, but there was just such a powerful image, and there was no attribution. Was there a line of poetry, or where did it come from? Did it come out of George Eliot's brain? But does it ring any bells for you? Oh, excuse the pun.
pun intended. It's not immediately coming to me, but I can tell you for sure that if there is no attribution, she did make it up. That's the one thing we do know about her epigraphs, and she had such an encyclopedic knowledge that she did draw on them from a lot of different sources. But now I feel like you caught me out. I mean, reading that book for so long, and I can't put my finger on. One of the fun things about George Eliot and social media is that she was maybe the main reason why I was glad when Twitter expanded their character length, which I was kind of ambivalent about overall. But she writes beautiful, beautiful sentences, but they tend to be very long, and it's really hard to quote them, in one little package if you want to share a quotation with somebody. So that was an advantage, to have a little bit more space for those wonderful lines. Yeah, she's a writer that I try to assign really regularly, partly because students still read a lot of Austen on their own. They still read a lot of the Brontes on their own, but they're pretty unlikely to pick up any George Eliot on their own. And I think they imagine it as being very intimidating. And not universally, but often they're so excited to discover that she's also extremely funny, and she's also extremely sarcastic. And she's also can be extremely melodramatic, and they can have all kinds of fun with her. Maybe you have to be a bit more patient with the long stretches of exposition, but some of them love that too. So I like to just put it out there. And nothing makes me happier than when a student from the past messages me or emails me and says, I saw somebody reading Middlemarch and it made me think of you and remember your class. Like, that's something I've done.
That's wonderful. I took a Victorian novel class as an undergrad at the University of Saskatchewan. I wonder if you might know my professor. I don't think he's around anymore. Lewis Horn.
I didn't know him personally. I mean, the name is familiar. It's a small academic world. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that year he had us read Adam Bede. So that was my first George Eliot. And I absolutely loved it. And if I ever reread a George Eliot, it would be that one. And then the other one was Daniel Deronda.
Oh my goodness. That's an ambitious one to assign to undergraduates. I think I'm not even sure I've ever done that. Graduate students, yes, but it's long, and it's also fairly difficult to get through some of those parts.
But it still resonated with me because at that point in my life, I was on a quest to find my birth parents. I'm an adoptee. And so the whole thing about Daniel Deronda and the father thing, it really resonated for me. So no, that book had a huge impact on me. So I don't know if I'm still a George Eliot fan. I've tried stuff recently that didn't go so well, but I'm sure I'll circle back to her eventually.
I think her most beautiful story about found families and birth families is Silas Marner, which is really, I think, a really heartwarming story about how what really matters is how we love each other and not how we're kind of biologically related to each other. Not that it's irrelevant, but that ultimately you make your family with the people that you are close to. And I think she understood that partly because she she was a stepmother and she didn't have her own biological children. So she had that experience of building a family on slightly different terms. Well, I'm encouraged to hear you say that you loved Adam Bede, because I am assigning it this fall for the first time in many years, and I'm just hoping that it goes over as well as it did the last time I taught it. I think it's got everything. It's bucolic and idyllic, and then it's tragic and dramatic, and so we'll see.
Yeah,
we'll see
wonderful.
how it goes.
Yeah, I loved it. Loved it, loved it, loved it. So she's your favorite Victorian author?
Yes. Yes.
And do you have a second favorite?
Yeah, that's an interesting question for me over the years. I mean, I have more, I would say, individual novels that are favorites than novelists. I'm a late convert to Dickens. Late, I guess, in the context of my overall career. Of course, you read him, but I think it's partly just through spending a lot of time with some of his novels that I've just come to such an appreciation for how experimental and just kind of off the wall they actually are, and the chances that he takes as a writer, and the amount of commitment he gives to everything he tries. I find that very endearing. The fact that they can be kind of messy and all over the place. I actually prefer that sometimes to something that's extremely well crafted and isn't letting any air in. So I would say that a novel like Bleak House is for me a pretty close second to Middlemarch, just in terms of how much I admire it and how much I think I benefit from spending time with it. But I have personal kind of affectionate favorites like Jane Eyre, which I read as a teenager, as many girls do, and have really had a long relationship with over the years. And to me, it's just such a thrilling book. And it takes, well, like Middlemarch, it takes different shapes as you read it at different times in your life. I'm reasonably certain that the first time I read Jane Eyre, I paid no attention whatsoever to St. John Rivers and the whole stuff that unfolds after the crisis in the novel. I'm assuming that you know Jane Eyre at least a little bit. Most people do.
Right.
After she leaves, and what you assume should be the love of her life. I'm sure I just thought the rest of it was just filling time until the happy ending. And now I read it in a very different way. Like, that's the really important part, where she's making decisions and coming to her own kind of moral authority. So I like a book that grows with you. I'm sure you have the same feeling for some of your favorite books, that one reason they've stayed favorites is that they're not the same every time you read them.
That's right. And sometimes rereading a book that you loved when you were much younger, you might not enjoy it as much, but it also is a journey in kind of remembering who you were as a reader back then. So there's all kinds of ways to reread and all kinds of benefits
Right.
from rereading. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. A
Do you
Middlemarch for
have
me is very much that way as well. That when I first read Middlemarch, when I was about Dorothea's age, and I it was all Dorothea's book to me, and now I read it and I'm like, I'm older than Mr. Casaubon, and I have something of the same feeling of what does my work mean and what will be left of it when I'm not here to shepherd it along. And it's a sobering moment when you discover that you're in that middle-aged place, and you're having to accept some of the disappointments and tragedies that in your naive, full blooming youth you just assume were for other people.
Yes, I have. Even in maybe my 30s was when I read Middlemarch, and I felt seen by what's his name, Casaubon, the scholar that never ever finished anything. I felt that hit a little too close to home for me, and I still have a shock of discomforting recognition of myself in that character. So, do you have a least favorite Victorian author?
Oh dear, yeah. Again, I think I would have to say it's more individual books where I just can't seem to forge the relationship with them that I feel I ought to. And I would say the leading contender absolutely in this category is Wuthering Heights. I understand it as a work of genius. I know many people who consider it by far a superior novel to Jane Eyre. I've never assigned it. And it's because every time I go to reread it to tell myself, really, I ought to love and assign, or at least, appreciate and assign this novel, I just find it such an unpleasant place to be. And I know that's the point, and I can embrace that intellectually, but I cannot get behind it. And I have a hard time. You have to put a lot of effort into, especially assigning things. I don't love every novel I teach. One of the hardest novels I teach for me is Jude the Obscure. Is just a relentless parade of misery, and every time you think it can't get worse, it gets worse. On the other hand, I think intellectually it's a really interesting and provocative novel, and it's really morally confrontational, so I can find some things to kind of propel me through it. And Wuthering Heights, I'm just like, people are just being mean to each other for 400 pages, and I just can't do it. So that's not a very professional thing to say, I suppose, for someone whose job is literally to get behind this material. but that's the truth for me. And by
Oh no,
contrast, I love a novel like Elizabeth Gaskell's Mary Barton, which is not a well-written novel. It's ham-fisted and heavy-handed and melodramatic and sentimental, and I'm all in, for that.
well, I'm all in for. I haven't read Mary Barton, but I've read almost everything else she's written, and I'm all in for Gaskell. Absolutely. We disagree quite strongly about Wuthering Heights. I love it. Every time I read it, I love it more. It's the Victorian novel I've reread the most. But
Isn't that
putting that
interesting?
aside, I'm totally with you on Jude the Obscure. It's the only Thomas Hardy that I didn't really like. It just left me feeling so morose.
Yeah. Well, it is a novel of absolute existential despair by the end. So I think, and the main character by the end is himself suicidal. So it's really brutal. Hardy has a poem called Nobody Comes. I think it's from the early part of the 20th century. And it really always captures the line, the same feeling as Jude. There's a moment in Jude where Jude is out in the fields and he's despairing and he's wishing someone would come to help him. And then the narrator says, but nobody did come because nobody does. And that's not Jude thinking that. That's the narrator making a kind of a statement about what the world is like. And it's what a devastating comment and not true, I think in the sense, but he's saying there is no divine help. There's no magic solution to this. And most of the time people won't help you either. And it is a grim vision. I'm sorry to put down Wuthering Heights. I do appreciate the novel as
Oh no,
a
no.
craft, but it's fascinating, isn't it? How people just react in these different ways. Yeah,
I've never met a reader who was neutral about
yeah.
Wuthering
Well, I will
Heights.
say
They're either
one time I got an email from someone who had happened across my blog, and he said Wuthering Heights was his wife's favorite novel or his fiance's favorite novel, and could I recommend a passage from it to read at their wedding? And I will say what I said back to him was, don't read from Wuthering Heights at your wedding. Like, I understand it's a romantic idea, but it is not the novel to to put behind that moment in your life. You really need to find something that's a little bit more hopeful or forward looking.
there have been a few opportunities over the course of my life where I have been able to inject my favorite line from Wuthering Heights in a kind of punny way or in some kind of a funny way into a conversation. Nellie, I am Heathcliff.
Right.
I love that. So tell us about your blog, Novel Readings.
Yeah, so I started it in 2007, which is starting to sound like a really long time ago. Yeah, and I didn't even really know at the time, but that was a little bit of a peak in the trend towards blogging. I was looking around quite incidentally for a way to conveniently share reading updates with family and friends, because I moved to Halifax, leaving most of my family and friends behind in Vancouver, and it's hard to stay in touch. And someone said, oh, you could just write it up on a blog, rather than emailing people individually or trying to do that. So that's why I started. I thought, well, this looks like fun. And then I started looking around and discovering that a lot of people were writing blogs about books. And it was very energizing for me, because I, at that time, was feeling fairly isolated out here in Halifax. It's a smallish town. I was very, very busy. I had young children. My job was very demanding, and a chance to just, chat about books with people, it was hard to find, except in those odd hours of the day when suddenly you've done all your work and your kids have finally gone to sleep, and then you can't just rush out for coffee and drinks with friends at whatever weird hour that might be. So blogging was a great discovery for me in that respect. And that's really what I started doing. And then the more I looked at other blogs, the more excited I got about the opportunity to develop a different kind of writing voice. I was feeling very stifled writing as an academic. I was trying to figure out what my next project would be, and not feeling terribly motivated to do a kind of Casaubon-like project that would be drilling deep down into obscurities, and maybe not something that would, I'm not anti-academic writing. I think it's really important that we have a sort of a kind of an energetic group of specialists doing everything that they find interesting, because first of all, that's the point of intellectual work, is to turn things around in your mind and come up with new ideas, and people should pursue the kind of work and the kind of writing that they want. And I know many people who really love that. They're not Casaubon like, they're just enthusiasts, and it's wonderful. But I was struggling to find my place or my voice or whatever. And at that time, there were a lot of people looking at blogging as a potential infusion into academic discourse. That the thing about academic writing is it's hard to spread it around. It's hard to get conversations about it. You publish it, it takes a long time. It finally appears, then you don't hear anything. And then maybe 10 years later, you discover somebody cited it. And you're like, oh, good. It would be fun to have something that would be a little bit more in the moment and energetic. And a lot, I think, of especially young academics who are feeling frustrated with the nature of academic publishing and academic research and also just academic life. We're finding blogging a promising alternative, a kind of open air market for I don't even like the word market for it, but just a place to share ideas and move the conversation forward through discussion and exchange. And so I started paying attention to that. I thought, well, this is something that I'm excited about too. I like this as a complement to specialized writing, to specialized research, way to move those ideas around out in the world so that maybe they get more people interested in them and just to show people what we're doing. So I would say that that's the first decade or so of novel readings, was my throwing myself into that as an idea. What kind of writing can I do? What kind of conversations can I join? What kind of people can I meet up with that aren't the sort of small pool of people just here in Halifax, but as it turned out, people in many different parts of the world, as you know too from your time on the internet. That's one of the incredible gifts that it's given us. It's just open doors or windows to those conversations all over the place.
Absolutely. And one of your very most recent posts, as of today, is about one of my favorite novels, J.L. Carr's A Month in the Country, which you loved too, didn't you?
Yeah. So in more recent years, I used to blog quite a bit about academia and about my classes, which I still try to do. But nowadays, it is still back to more of that original, just a book sort of record, a commonplace book, a place to record what I've read. I do find, as you may too, that if I don't write or talk about what I've read, I forget. So it's a great sort of aid to memoir for me. Books I read before I blog, I don't even know, what they were. So yeah, I belatedly came to A Month in the Country, which you mentioned before as one of your very favorite books. Mm-hmm. It's sort of perverse. I had heard from so many people what a perfect little book it was that I kind of shied away from it. I thought, I don't know, how good can it be? I have a bit of I feel like I should say this in a hushed tone, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with NYRD classics, which are beloved, of course, of the bookish internet. It's hit or miss for me. And so I wasn't sure. Anyway, stupid reasons sometimes. But I was out the other night and I saw it on the shelf, and for some reason I just said, now is the time. Took it off the shelf. I brought it home. Oh my goodness, did I love it. What a beautiful, beautiful book. Yeah. What is your favorite thing about it? Why is it one you go back to?
The only way I know how to talk to describe what it is I love about it is that it's about everything in about 140 pages. It's about art and war and love and betrayal and sexuality or eros and memories and the past. It just has so much in it, and I don't think I need to read any other book. It's all in there.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. And it is amazing how much involves for such a slim little volume. I mean, just the discussions of the actual painting that he is restoring.
Oh my God.
You get into all this technical detail about the colors and the paints and the technique, but it's only probably cumulatively a few pages out of the book, but you feel like you have learned so much about the painting, about the process. And then as he starts to imagine the artist, I know it's astonishing. And I really did feel like there was an almost allegorical level to it, that it's pretty clear that as he restores the painting, there's some kind of restoration going on in his life, but it never had that feeling like I'm sort of being hit in the head with this obvious transformation. And maybe that's partly because the painting gets restored, but his life doesn't really magically change. It's like the possibility of change, the dream, the romance, the falling in love. But then he leaves the painting behind and he goes back again, so that what he has is just the memory of it. And I like that it was tempting us to see it as metaphorical, but not insisting on it in a kind of cliched way. Yeah.
I am so obsessed with that book. I've read it now maybe 4 times, and last year I read J.L. Carr's biography. It's called The Last Englishman, The Life of J.L. Carr, and the author is Byron Rogers. And it too is a work of art. It's a masterful literary biography. I haven't read a ton. I haven't read nearly as many literary biographies as you have, I'm sure, but it's the best one I've ever read. His life was so unusual, and the biography is so unusual in it's like experimental biography. It's the structure of it, the way that it's written. It's just incredible. So yeah, I'm not sure that anything else J.L. Carr wrote comes anywhere near to A Month in the Country, but his life was absolutely fascinating.
Interesting. All I know about it is there's an introduction in the NYRB Classics edition by Michael Holroyd, which gives a bit of an account of that. But yeah, you do get that sense that this was the book that he was supposed to write, and this must be odd to be that writer. I know that that's sort of it in terms of your best work. You'd think it would be gratifying, but maybe also a little discouraging. Like, how will you ever? What was it that made everything fall into place for that? Maybe he didn't know. I'm not sure. I think I had not realized that it was written as late as 1980. Everything about it made it look like a book from the 30s or 40s. Like Rebecca West's Return of the Soldier or something. Like it. I thought it was more contemporary to its setting, and I wonder too if that sort of distance isn't part of why he was able to be so smart about it somehow, that he was working with nostalgia from a long distance away or something like that. Yeah.
There's all kinds of biographical aspects to it that the biography really fleshes out. So, Rowan, what have you been reading recently that you'd like to recommend aside from A Month in the Country?
Yes, well, definitely A Month in the Country at the top. So my reading lately has been a little bit random, which is sort of fun because I read a lot under obligation during the rest of the year because I'm rereading mostly all the time for teaching. I've read a couple of things for reviews recently, and I won't go into detail about them because you'll be able to read my opinions in print, but I will just mention that I read a really interesting collection of short stories by Sara Maitland called True North, which would be, my review will be in the TLS soon, and it was a revelation in terms of a variety of stories. But things I've read just for myself, one that I picked up recently is, I think a lot of people will have already read it. It is sort of catnip to people with our reading habits, The Diary of a Bookseller. And I was a little skeptical maybe about it. I always feel a little bit manipulated when I read or come across books that are clearly for and about bookish people. You're like, they know they're going to sell them because who else is in a bookstore except people who want to read about bookstores. But I saw it and I'd heard it was very funny, and it is very funny. I don't know if you read it, but I was reading it out on my balcony here in my apartment, and I was just chortling away to myself, and I thought my neighbors are going to wonder what's wrong with this crazy woman upstairs, that he did get me. But I will say too, he also made me feel really self-conscious as someone who's often in bookstores, and you make sort of casual small talk, and he made me wonder what terrible gaffes or what things have I said that have made the booksellers look at each other behind my back. He's pretty ruthless about his customers. He makes it sound like they always deserve it. They don't seem to know anything. They seem to have incredible expectations for discounts and all the rest of it. But it's a pretty funny read, and also it's a fun little glimpse at that behind the scenes work of running a bookstore, which I think many of us sort of fantasize about. I have a friend actually who opened a secondhand bookstore and ran it for a few years, and her story is also hair raising. So I know better than to dream of it, but there's this vacant storefront not far from me. It just looks like it would make an amazing bookstore. And so I'm definitely keeping a lid on that. That's a retirement dream based on what it sounds like it would be like in practice. Yeah.
Wonderful. Let me recommend one to you because it's little known. Several years ago, I read a memoir type book like this called The Bookstore That Floated Away.
Oh, my
goodness. It's
goodness.
by a young British woman named Sara Henshaw, who bought a houseboat or maybe a barge. I'm not sure what the difference between those two. I'm not pretty stupid about things on the water, vessels on the water, and made a floating bookstore. And she went all around the UK, wherever she could get by river, and just would park at this little village and this and that little village and sell books. And she wrote a really hilarious and fascinating and insightful memoir about the experience, The Bookstore That Floated Away. I absolutely loved it.
I am going to look for that for sure, because that sounds incredibly good. Not just the bookstore part, but the whole traveling around on the water. And I think what I might like more than anything would be if there was someone who just drove around on the streets with a bookstore here, it would show up. I don't live on a river or anything, so it's not going to happen to me by water, but just the fun of that would be great. I do now live walking distance to our one of our best independent bookstores. So I do find that that is a great seduction. If you're sitting around feeling a little bit like the books on your shelves are just somehow not the ones you want, and you think, well, 5 minutes from here is a whole bookstore. But if the bookstore would come to me, that would be even better. Now, my other recent reading really couldn't be more different, I think. And again, I'm sort of late to this party, but this is Louise Kennedy's novel Trespasses,
Yes,
set
wonderful
during
novel.
the Troubles. Yeah, really wonderful novel, really fraught and disturbing and distressing in all the predictable ways. I was really interested in how she presses on I guess it's an obvious point, especially given her setting, but the way that the personal and the political just cannot be separated. But she doesn't make any sort of sentimental, can't we just all get along sort of, it's not a love story that transcends. It's just about the messiness of it and the intractability of it. And I think a lot of us have watched and really enjoyed, for instance, the comedy Dairy Girls, and I think that it takes a comic approach, but underneath it is that element of sort of sadness, like having to make a life that's sort of fully human in the face of what's going on around you. And Kennedy does a good job, I think, in a very different register of kind of showing us just the day-to-day grind of it. Every time the chapters open with a little rundown of the news, right, like she does with her students, and sometimes I wouldn't pick up right away that one of those news stories was somebody that we knew from the novel, and then you go back and you realize, like, the news is us. The news is them. It's not, the news doesn't happen to other people. It happens to the people that we know, the people that they know. And I thought that was really deft. So a very distressing sort of book, but not sort of book that's sort of a kind of horrible tourism to the misery, but it's just an attempt to make it real to us, I think. Yeah.
Well, the way you've described it, you've transported me right back into the book. So you've described it very, very well. I have her short story collection, which I think was published just before her novel. She is a late bloomer writer. I think she's probably around our age and has these two works of fiction have just come out in the last 3 or 4 years, and I hope that there's many more to come.
I mean, in terms of narrative, it's a relatively straightforward book. I think the most recent book I read with sort of similar themes would be Anna Burns's Milkman, which is a very different kind of book to read, much more, I think, difficult to. It's very immersive, but it was also, it's sort of stylistically more. I think maybe the word I think of is like clever or obscure or something. It makes it more challenging. But I think there's something deceptive about Kennedy's straightforward narration, that, these moments that she keeps catching you out and taking you by surprise. And maybe that mimics a bit of the life of her characters who are trying to go about their business and the bomb explodes or somebody's assassinated. And that's just what it's like. You go to work at the pub and you can't be really sure if you say the wrong thing, who's listening. And it's really disorienting.
I could talk to you about books and reading all day, but I suppose we should wrap up. But what a delight to finally meet you this way, Rowan, and I hope that you'll come back.
Yes, I would love to. And it does always feel like, when you've known people online a long time, you sort of feel like we have already met, but this is definitely different. And in many ways, it's always so much better to put sort of the face and the voice and the books and the talk all together. So I'm glad to be a part of your booktube community, whereas, I'm a tourist or a visitor, because I'm out in the book blog world where you can't see our faces so much. So this is a fun little excursion for me. I appreciate the invitation.
Open invitation to come back anytime, Rowan. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Shaun.
This is my other mystery guest today. This is Charlie. I'm looking after Mum's dog for the day, so he's keeping me out of trouble. Chewing up a business card that fell to the floor, so I hope I didn't need that information. Anyway, Rowan Maitland, what a fabulous conversationalist. You should be following her on Twitter and following her blog, and she's going to be coming back time and time again until she gets sick of me inviting her. Loved talking to her. I've had put up some great stuff on my channel, if I do say so myself, this week. Only 2, but I'm very pleased with both of them. Another book haul on the weekend, and then just yesterday, a fabulous episode of Zooming In. This one is a lovely chat with Bob the Booker about keeping up his readers and his booktube and his bookish content creators. And Bob and I just really have a good time when we have these discussions, so I'm going to be having them back on real soon, so check those out. I don't have any new patrons to tell you about, but I do want to remind you that if you join soon, I think there's another week, you can vote on the poll for the next book club book or series of books. I think we're going to do the top 3 or 4 of them. in order. The vote for that closes in the next week. And patrons at any level have the option of participating in the weekly bookish brunch, and the next one of those is scheduled for next Saturday, the 20th. So then you would have that to look forward to, too, if you joined right away. All right, I haven't gotten a lot of reading done this week. I have to say that the heat kind of did a number on me, and I wasn't at my perkiest reading-wise. But I did finish one marvelous novel. And that was Morgan Talty's debut novel. It's his second work of fiction, his debut novel, Fire Exit. Just came out about a month ago, and this was a buddy read with Heidi. I loved it more than Heidi. Heidi really enjoyed it. I thought it was superb. And let me try and tell you about it. It's a difficult book to talk about, but I want to describe what was unusual about it that really worked for me, but might not work for every reader. So I remember talking about this when I did my preliminary check-in a couple of weeks ago. The protagonist, Charles, he's a bit of an empty character. So I'm a reader who really cares about character development, and the characters in this novel, they were not superficial characters. They were not shallow characters. But the way that Morgan Talty does the... Come on, Charlie, I'm trying to talk to my people. But the way that Morgan Talty does his character work here is just fascinating. So Charles, the first-person protagonist, he's kind of devoid of any personality. He's kind of a blank slate. And it really, really worked. And I think by the end of the book, well, certainly for me, by the end of the novel, I could see why he had that kind of passive, vacant personality. And I found him absolutely fascinating. He's a white guy, and his mum, he's about 50, which I read him as much younger throughout the novel. I don't know why, but apparently he's about 50, and he grew up, most of his childhood was growing up on the Penobscot Reservation in Maine, because his mother married a Penobscot man. And so he grew up in that culture and loved the culture and felt it was his own culture. But the blood quantum thing, that if you weren't at least such percentage indigenous, you couldn't live on the reservation. And certainly as a stepson of an indigenous man with no indigenous blood, once he came of age, he had to leave the reservation. And so he just moved across the water. His stepdad built him a house, and there's a lot in here about houses, and the houses have more personality than the characters. And again, I'm not saying this as a criticism. It's just a really wonderfully wacky way of telling a story. He had a girlfriend, I don't know whether they called themselves boyfriend and girlfriend, but very young, and she got pregnant, and because of this whole blood quantum thing, her child would not be... Editing shot here, I got a little mixed up here. She was of a certain percentage of indigenous blood, so that if she had a child with a white guy, that child would not meet the blood quantum minimum to be a member of the Penobscot Nation. And so she just kind of walked out of our main character, Charles's life, as soon as she knew she was pregnant, and married an indigenous man and raised it as if it was theirs. And their house was right across the water. I think it was a river. I'm not good with bodies of water. See my earlier confusion about what kind of boat when I was talking about that book, the bookshop that floated away. And so that might strain credulity that he lived right across the water and he kind of watched his daughter grow up. But it didn't, I don't mind my credulity being strained, actually. There were a lot of coincidences in this book, and they didn't bother me at all either. I thought they were perfect and good, and I'm the kind of person who's had a lot of coincidences shape my life. So if you're a little bit allergic to coincidences, you might struggle with that part, but I hope you don't. So in the present of the story, Charles has this yearning to talk to his daughter for the first time. He did meet her once and it didn't go well for about 10 minutes when she was about 5 years old or something. Beyond that, he's never had any contact with her. And he wants to tell her that he's her father. He says he doesn't want to have a relationship with her or be a part of her life, but he wants her to know her heritage. It's important to him, he tells us, the readers, that she know who she is. And I think he's a bit of an unreliable narrator, and I think he did have other motivations for doing it. And so that's part of the story. His mother and him have a kind of remote relationship, and she suffered from depression when he was younger, and now with a lot of dementia, whether it's Alzheimer's or whatever. And maybe that's enough. But there's an element of mystery and suspense and crazy characters that seem to be minor, and by the end you're realizing they were almost as important as Charles and his daughter to the story. And it's fast-paced, and none of the characters have that embodied, fleshed-out quality that I look for in my literary fiction, but they were all indelibly described and in motion. They were so busy moving around, going here and there, that the character work was deep but blurry. I loved it. I'm not going to try to say any more. I think it's probably going to end up being a Marmite book. You're either going to love it or really not get on with it at all. It's one of the best books I've read this year. Absolutely loved it. So that's really it. Like that's all I managed to finish. I've just been so darn sleepy this week. Done a lot of sleeping, not a whole lot of reading. Well, I got to get my groove back again, because that was the buddy read with Heidi. So the next one we're tackling is going to take us to almost the end of the year to finish. And that is this tome, The Deluge by Stephen Markley. I was a huge fan of his debut novel, Ohio, and this is his cli-fi, climate fiction novel. It clocks in at almost 900 pages, and we're only going to be reading about 50 pages a week because that's all I can really manage. I'm just kind of slowing down in my old age, so I will probably give you a preliminary check-in next week, or certainly the week after, and then you won't hear about this until the fall. But I'm excited about it. That's what I'm gonna be starting this weekend. And that's all I have to say. So, please, love to hear your comments on anything I've said here. Thanks for watching.